Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some trade news for the San Jose Sharks. In the usual quiet part of the offseason, the Sharks have made a move, which is to trade away defenseman Ty Emberson to the Edmonton Oilers in exchange for defenseman Cody Ceci, as well as a third-round pick in this year's draft coming from the Oilers themselves. Now, this is a trade that can be viewed in a couple of different ways, the first of which is within the context of the situation that the Edmonton Oilers currently find themselves in. It was only a few days ago where a couple of their RFAs were given offer sheets by the St. Louis Blues, which meant that the Oilers would have only a very limited amount of time to actually match those contracts if they wanted to keep one or both of those players around. The problem for the Oilers is that they are right up against the cap, which means to make it happen, they would need to clear out space and to do so very, very quickly. So it seemed as though every general manager around the league would be very aware of the position that the Oilers found themselves in, and as such, they might have to pay a premium to clear that space. One of the prime candidates definitely was Cody Ceci, the player that the Sharks would indeed end up acquiring because he was a relatively expendable player for the Oilers, plus he was making a decent amount of money with just 1 year left on his contract, and it was speculated perhaps that the Oilers would have to pay up to a first-round pick to be able to make a trade happen. So the fact that the Sharks only end up getting a third-round pick and the Oilers' own third-round pick, which is likely to find itself pretty late in the third round, might be viewed as a bit of a disappointment. When you also keep in mind the fact that it was just a couple of months ago when the Sharks picked up Barclay Goodrow off of waivers, seemingly letting the New York Rangers off the hook for his salary. It is now twice over these last couple of months in which Mike Grier has seemingly done a bit of a favor for a couple of other NHL teams. And with this one being a division rival like the Edmonton Oilers are, it is not necessarily the best reputation to develop. But of course, we don't necessarily, from a Sharks perspective, need to keep in mind the context that the Oilers are in. And instead, we can strictly evaluate this trade from a player-to-player basis. Emberson being traded for Cody Ceci and a third-round pick. Well, Emberson this past season for the San Jose Sharks was actually pretty good. He didn't get to play a ton of games, not because he was a healthy scratch ever, really, but instead because he was struggling to actually keep himself healthy. He was injured multiple times over with seemingly different injuries that kept him out of the lineup for pretty much over half of the season. However, when Emberson was healthy, he was one of the most effective defensemen for the San Jose Sharks. This isn't necessarily saying much, as we know that the Sharks' defensive core was really, really bad this year, but still, for Emberson to have managed to rise to the top of that was rather impressive for a player who was technically still a rookie in that first season. This is not to say that he's going to pan out to be an elite player at the NHL level over these next few years, but it definitely seemed clear that he had some potential. And on top of that, he still is, a right-handed defenseman, which is something that the Sharks are severely lacking in their defensive prospect pool. Among their really big names in that area, Sam Dickinson, Henry Thrun, Shakir Mukhamadullin, all of them are left-handed defensemen. So Emberson, while he's not necessarily as young as them, I believe he is 24 years old at the moment, he was still technically a defensive prospect playing on the correct side for San Jose, so it's certainly a bit of a loss for the Sharks to have actually given him up, especially when you consider the fact that this is a cap dump type of situation. Most of the time when a team is picking up a cap dump player, the player who they are trading back isn't very valuable. If you look back at last offseason when the Sharks did a sort of similar trade, not that similar, but kind of, when they picked up Anthony Duclair from the Florida Panthers, the Sharks traded back Steven Lorentz, who was barely a fourth-line forward without really much ceiling or room for growth. So for Emberson, who actually had some decent potential to be the one given back, is definitely somewhat disappointing. When it comes to what the Sharks got back in return, like I've said multiple times now, Cody Ceci, he is at the very least also a right-handed defenseman, which means the Sharks aren't going to be lacking more in an area that they already are lacking in. On top of that, Cody Ceci does bring a certain level of consistency, as well as Emberson did do last season. It was in a limited time frame. There's no telling that he'd be able to actually repeat such a performance in the following season compared to Cody Ceci, who already has multiple seasons under his belt. You pretty much know what you are going to get out of this player. The problem is that what you are going to get out of this player isn't really all that great. It should be pointed out that Ceci was played in sometimes a top 4 role for the Edmonton Oilers this past season, and also the Oilers were one of the best teams in the league. They made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals Game 7 before dropping to the Panthers in that final game. And so for Ceci to have found himself in a pretty big role on that team is rather impressive. The problem is, if you actually take a look at his stats, those aren't very good. And for his stats to not be very good on such a great team is pretty telling of the type of player he is. It is sort of reminiscent of when the Sharks picked up Jan Rutta last offseason, another defenseman who was not necessarily that great, but was coming from a very successful place with the Tampa Bay Lightning, where he won a couple of Stanley Cups. That is kind of the situation that Cody Ceci is in, because he was on a team that was very familiar with having success, very good at winning hockey games, and perhaps Mike Grier is hopeful that that can rub off a bit onto the rest of the Sharks defensemen. It didn't work with Jan Rutta, perhaps maybe now it will work with Cody Ceci, but realistically, while maybe in the immediate future Cody Ceci is a better option than Ty Emberson, the fact is that 3 years down the line, Ty Emberson could have theoretically still been a player for San Jose who would actually be quite good, and there is absolutely no chance Cody Ceci is, or very, very little chance that Cody Ceci is still involved with the San Jose Sharks, even by this time next season. There are the potential possibilities that he could get flipped further down the line, perhaps at the trade deadline of this season, and that the Sharks can end up extracting even more value from this trade. But the problem there is that Ceci is making a relatively hefty amount of money at $4.3 million, and the Sharks do not have a retention slot still available. That next one does come back when Brent Burns' contract expires at the end of this next season, which means the team would have to take on the entirety of his contract to actually bring him on. Even if this could be possible, it would be a lot more difficult than if the Sharks could retain 50% of it, which means the Sharks are going to end up getting less assets back in return if such a trade could even materialize. So it is still not necessarily going to be that great. And then when it comes to the 3rd round pick that the Sharks are getting back, like I said, the Oilers, very good team, so this is going to end up being a pretty late in the 3rd round type of selection. Having said that, 3rd round picks do carry a decent amount of value in the NHL, so if Mike Grier wants to use that at some point down the line to move up in the draft or to pick up a different player, something like that, this could definitely still be a decent pick. But as I mentioned earlier on, maybe it's going to leave a bit some Sharks fans wondering what more could San Jose have gotten here out of this salary cap dump deal. At the end of the day, having said all that, this is a trade that kind of reminds me of the Mikey Eyssimont deal from last season. That was when the Sharks picked up Mikey Eyssimont off of waivers. He was immediately a very impactful player for the San Jose Sharks, played about 20 games for them, and then got traded away to the Winnipeg Jets in sort of a 3-man deal that eventually got the Sharks a 4th round pick. And that seemed like a bit of an underpayment for the type of effort that Eyssimont was putting up, but it was a situation that because Eyssimont was picked up off of waivers, theoretically you could view it as the Sharks having picked up a 4th round pick for free. When you consider the fact that Ty Emberson was picked up off of waivers at the beginning of this past season from the New York Rangers, once again, you can view this as the Sharks having gotten a 3rd round pick for free. So in sort of a vacuum, I guess, this isn't that bad of a deal for San Jose, but at the same time, it's not one that Mike Grier is going to be bragging about. This is not one that's really a home run move for the San Jose Sharks. It's something that you're going to perhaps look back on over these next couple of years, depending on how things work out for Ty Emberson as a player, and say, maybe the Sharks should have hung on to him a bit more. Class dismissed.